Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jennifer Van Vleck. I am a curator in the Aeronautics Division at the National Air and Space Museum, and I'm speaking to you today from our Udvar-Hazy Center near Dulles Airport in Chantilly, Virginia. And I'm going to be talking about the artifacts in this case behind me, which is our Stanley King collection of Lindbergh memorabilia. And I want to emphasize, for those of you who are watching this on Facebook Live, please feel free to write in with questions at any time during this talk. I will take questions at the end. So this talk really is structured around three parts. At the beginning, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Charles Lindbergh and who he was, focusing on his historic transatlantic flight. And then I'm going to move in and talk about how we came to acquire these objects. And finally, I will focus on a few specific artifacts in this case that I think really exemplify this collection and its historic significance. So the reason why I'm talking to you today and this particular week in May is because this past weekend, May 20th and 21st, was the 90th anniversary of Charles Lindbergh's historic transatlantic nonstop solo flight, which was one of the most important milestones in aviation history and indeed in 20th century history more broadly. So this was in 1927. It was the first time that anyone had ever flown a heavier-than-air aircraft nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean. And Lindbergh's decision to cross the Atlantic solo was a feat of such daring that at the time it earned him nicknames like the Flying Fool, and then after the flight was successfully accomplished, the nickname Lucky Lindy, which is a name that appears on many items in this case. And for this feat, he received the Ortigue Prize, which was offered by a wealthy New York hotelier. The prize was worth $25,000 at the time. Now it would be worth around $350,000, so quite an amazing accomplishment. The plane that Lindbergh flew on this flight, the Spirit of St. Louis, is prominently displayed in our building on the National Mall. And he, in fact, donated this plane to the Smithsonian in 1928. Now, of course, this was before the National Air and Space Museum was built in 1976. So prior to that, it was displayed in our Arts and Industries buildings. But as you can see here, the museum also holds a treasure trove of artifacts which testify to Lindbergh's cultural significance, his iconic status in American popular culture from 1927 through today. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. When Lindbergh landed in Paris 33 and a half hours after he had taken off from Long Island, a crowd of 150,000 people swarmed the airfield. Lindbergh described it as a human tidal wave, and they literally ripped pieces of fabric off of the plane in a mad quest for souvenirs. Overnight, the tall, slender 25-year-old aviator became the most famous man in the world. And in many ways, Lindbergh was the first modern celebrity. For example, New York City papers alone published nearly 300,000 stories about him during the first 12 days after the flight. And motion picture cameras filmed over 7 million feet of newsreel coverage, making Lindbergh the most filmed newsreel subject to date. In the summer of 1927, Lindbergh flew the Spirit of St. Louis around the United States, and he stopped in 92 cities. At every stop of the tour, souvenirs were available for sale, such as, for example, the many coins, medals, buttons, and pins in this section of the case. So these kinds of objects, such as in these shadow boxes, are things that ordinary people bought when they went to see him during this 1927 tour. And during this time, people all over the country went plane crazy, to quote the title of a 1928 Disney film in which Lindbergh inspires Mickey Mouse to fly an airplane. So this Lindbergh mania, I want to argue, offers a window into the growth of celebrity culture and consumer culture during the interwar period. As Lindbergh transformed aviation, his celebrity transformed America's cultural and commercial landscape. And now, this was somewhat ironic because Lindbergh was not at all comfortable with being famous, particularly after the horrific kidnapping and murder of his baby son in 1932. But even before that, he didn't really like being in the limelight. And in fact, he viewed flying in a sense as a refuge from the constant public scrutiny that he received when he was on the ground. Okay, so I'm going to move into talking a little bit about the origins of this collection, why we have it here at the museum, and who I'll start by telling you a little bit about the donor. So this collection of artifacts was donated to us by a man named Stanley King, hence the name, the Stanley King Collection. King is the owner of a New York-based textile business and also a musician and artist. And he began collecting Lindbergh memorabilia when he was in his 20s. He started by paying 25 cents a piece for dozens of buttons and ribbons. And this ultimately spawned a collection that was worth over $500,000, or he spent over $500,000 on the memorabilia that he acquired from auction houses such as Christie's and Sotheby's, as well as online sources like eBay. In this case, there are nearly 400 artifacts, but the collection itself contains over 900. The rest of these objects are carefully preserved at our museum's storage facility. And in fact, you can see photos and descriptions of most of them on the museum's website. If you go to the section that's entitled Collections, go search the collections, and then you can enter various search terms. If you enter Lindbergh, you will get every single artifact that we have relating to Lindbergh, which is around, I think, 2,000. But if you enter King Collection, in quotes, you will get items from this collection specifically. So if you want to see anything in this case or things that are not on display in more detail, you're welcome to search our website. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the artifacts in the case itself. The two middle shelves here, these are actually artifacts from Lindbergh's own flights. So as you can see, they include, these are objects from the Spirit of St. Louis. You can see they include flight boots, a helmet, some tools. Over on the next shelf, these are objects from the 1931 and 33 North Arctic Great Circle flights that he and his wife Anne performed in their plane, the Tingma Sartog, which we also have at the museum downtown. And these artifacts were donated to the museum either by Lindbergh himself or they were transferred from the U.S. Air Force Museum. So the rest of the objects in the case, though, which is what I'm going to spend my time on today, so basically the top shelf, the bottom shelf, and these two right and left panels, these feature the Lindbergh memorabilia that Stanley King donated. As you can see, there is a dizzying array of stuff in here, everything from commemorative buttons and coins to women's handbags to decorative items like vases and bookends, jewelry and watches, toys and games, and even here, a ukulele. And of course, if I talked about every item in here, we would be standing here until tomorrow. So again, I'm going to focus on a few kind of groups of artifacts and a few particular individual artifacts that I think are representative of this collection and its significance and what it tells us about kind of Lindbergh mania in American popular culture. And I'm going to start by moving over here and talking about some of the consumer products that bore Lindbergh's image. Now, I mentioned before that this collection is helpful for understanding not just the history of aviation, but the history of consumer culture in general. And you can see, for example, there is a can of soap up top here. It's Lindy brand soap, the first hand cleaner to make dirt fly. There is a soda bottle here, a Lindy beverage, which was actually manufactured by Coca-Cola. And Lindbergh's name even appeared on cigarette lighters and liquor bottles. There's a display of lighters here and a bottle of bourbon over here on the top right shelf, bearing an image of a Saturday Evening Post cover that he was on. And it's ironic that his image and name appeared on these kinds of products because Lindbergh notoriously neither drank alcohol nor smoked. And I should emphasize that these manufacturers did not obtain his permission to use his image. He didn't really like it very much. He made no profits off of this kind of marketing. But again, this is kind of the birth of consumer culture and marketing strategies, and manufacturers of mass-produced goods were very eager to capitalize on Lindbergh's celebrity. So again, the history of celebrity culture and the history of consumerism and the mass production of consumer goods goes hand in hand in the interwar period. And I'll also just point out one of my favorite examples of this over here on the bottom right of the case is a display of perfume. If you can see, it reads, "Lucky Lindy, the essence of luck." It has an image of the Statue of Liberty and the Eiffel Tower. And this was a common motif on a lot of Lindbergh objects, using monuments of the United States and France to communicate the symbolism of his journey from New York to Paris. Now, I have been told that these vials actually do contain perfume. I personally have not smelled it because they arrived here before I arrived in my position at the museum, but apparently there is still perfume in there. The case also contains a number of decorative objects, many exemplifying the Art Deco style that was very popular in the 1920s and 30s. And one that I particularly like is this silver serving tray. It might be a little bit hard to see, particularly for those of you who are watching online, but it is, you can see there's an image of an airplane. There's an airplane. The propeller actually spins. It's on top of a globe. And then surrounding the tray, again, are iconic buildings from the United States and France. The Arc de Triomphe, the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame. And then on the other side, we have the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, and the Statue of Liberty. And then over here, another example of decorative objects, these green and black vases, again in the Art Deco style. So the case contains several different types of objects. On the one hand, we have, these kind of mass-produced, buttons and souvenirs, that ordinary people purchased. On the other hand, we have these much fancier kind of high-end decorative objects. And I should say that Art Deco in particular was a style that very much emphasized modernity, and the airplane as well at this time epitomized modernity. So it's not surprising that in decorative household objects in this style, you see aviation motifs, and you see Lindbergh influencing that kind of aesthetic. Okay, we're going to walk down to the end of the case now and take a look at another set of artifacts that we have, and these are watches. So we have a number of watches in the case. And I want to talk about the one in the back in particular, which is a Bulova watch. And the inside of the box lid reads "The Lone Eagle," another one of Lindbergh's nicknames. The Lone Eagle in honor of Charles A. Lindbergh. So Bulova had given a watch to Lindbergh, and the company subsequently trademarked a replica that became one of its best-selling products. Around 50,000 of these watches were sold between 1927 and 1931. And in many ways, Lindbergh and his association with Bulova really put that company on the map. So another example of his legacy being used to sell a product, and in this case, to really kind of help create a company's reputation. And then on this, on the bottom shelf here, we have a number of products for children, toys, games, and model airplanes. So for example, this is an electric rotating toy airplane tower. I'm told that the thing actually spins like really, really fast. I kind of want to see it in action, but again, I arrived after these artifacts arrived, so I did not get to see it. We also have several games in the case. This is one here. New York to Paris, the airplane game. Similarly here, a kind of punch game. And I should mention there are lots and lots of these games, and they're still around. In fact, if you look on eBay, you might have a chance of purchasing one for yourself. And then another children's item that I find interesting is this model aircraft kit. It has components with which kids can make 15 different types of airplanes, including the Spirit of St. Louis. And according to the wording on the box, by building these model airplanes, your son or daughter may find the answer to some of the problems still facing aviation. And I think it's interesting that the manufacturer marketed this kit to girls as well as boys, because this was not always the case with model airplanes. Model airplanes were often, kind of marketed as boys' toys exclusively. But here they're saying that they're appealing to girls as well. And I should emphasize that in this era, just as adults were going and collecting these household objects and commemorative coins and souvenirs, children were very much caught up in this kind of Lindbergh consumer culture. And Lindbergh was idolized by children of that generation, just as astronauts would be later idolized by children. And in fact, in Lindbergh's archives at Yale University, which I have used in my research, there are dozens of letters from children, which are really just fascinating to read and demonstrate the ways in which he really inspired a new generation to become interested in aviation and flying. Okay, so the last object that I want to call your attention to is a little bit unique. It's this banjo up here. So we saw the ukulele previously, and now this banjo, it's a tenor banjo, and what makes it unique is that it's not really a historical artifact. It was manufactured, it was custom made for Stanley King, our generous donor who gave the museum this collection. And it's extremely ornate. The whole thing is covered with carvings of the Spirit of St. Louis. The interior of it shows an eagle grasping the American and French flags in its claws. Again, there are motifs of the Statue of Liberty and the Eiffel Tower. There's a carving of Lindbergh's head in a flight cap and goggles, and then Lindbergh's name as well as his well-known nicknames, Lucky Lindy and the Lone Eagle. So the banjo is really a kind of just very ornate, very unique tribute to Lindbergh's enduring popular appeal. In this case, this was created for a collector fairly recently. And I should mention as well that there are still companies that use Lindbergh's image or his name in their marketing. And one of the items that we have in our collection that is not on display here, it's in storage, is a pair of women's underwear with Lindbergh's face printed all over it. So all kinds of interesting ways in which Lindbergh has been used, or his image has been used to sell products not only in the late 1920s, but even in the present. Okay, so I'm going to draw some broader conclusions about the cultural significance of this collection. So when you're here at Udvar-Hazy or when you're at our downtown building, it's easy to be awed by the giant aircraft and spacecraft in our collection. The Boeing 707, which is across from me, you can't see it because you're looking at me, the Space Shuttle, the Concorde. But I want to argue that small artifacts, as I hope that this presentation has demonstrated, are also historically important. And I think that they're especially historically important if we're interested in learning about the social and cultural history of aviation, which is my specialty. Objects like this demonstrate what aviation meant to people. And in this case, in this particular case, the material culture of Lindbergh memorabilia also sheds light on major developments in 1930s, 1920s, and 1930s America. And two in particular I've emphasized today. One, the emergence of a modern consumer culture that was enabled by techniques of modern mass production that could churn out Lucky Lindy buttons and things like that by the thousands. Secondly, the emergence of a culture of celebrity And this was enabled by technologies like the radio and the newsreel, also relatively new at the time, which broadcast news and images of Lindbergh to people around the world. As well as this culture of celebrity was also influenced by new marketing strategies that used famous people's names and images to sell products. Now, it could be easy to dismiss these kinds of objects as mere kitsch. And indeed, for many years, historians and curators didn't really think that they were that historically significant. They didn't take these artifacts as worthy of display in museums or worthy of serious historical scholarship. Unfortunately, that has changed in the last several decades. And now we are seeking to understand cultural history in relation to the history of technology that is on display here at the museum in the form of the aircraft themselves. So I argue that these objects, from humble buttons to stunning Art Deco household items, offer fascinating glimpses into how the history of aviation, and in this case, Charles Lindbergh in particular, can illuminate the broader history of American culture and society. Thank you so much, and I will be happy to take questions.
So we'll start with online questions, and if you can just repeat them.
Sure.
So how do these objects help you do your work?
How do these objects help me do my work? That's a really good question. So I am planning to write an article or possibly a book about this collection. So in that case, these objects will be my primary sources, along with other kinds of sources like archival documents. But they also help me, as I think I've sort of suggested today, they help me think about material culture as a way of understanding history. In other words, the history isn't just about, documents and letters and things that we would find in an archive, but it is about material things that often have real emotional significance for people. So in terms of understanding culture, particularly in understanding kind of the reception of culture, that is how kind of ordinary people understood cultural trends, I think that these kinds of objects can really help us, help illuminate that. And that's often a difficult question to get at. It's easier to kind of, there's more documentation, in other words, about the production of culture than there is about the reception of culture. And here we have a window into why and how Lindbergh was so enormously popular among ordinary people during this time.
So we have another exhibit here that displays objects with balloons on them. Do you see parallels between kind of that, people wanting to have a small object to take with them?
I do, absolutely. So we have this, the question was that we have another exhibit here on the cultural history of balloons. And that exhibit features actually another really interesting moment in the history of consumer culture, which was that in the 18th century, people were fascinated by balloons and they collected objects that had images of balloons on them and various types of artwork that featured balloons. And there was a kind of balloon mania trend at that time that I think parallels the Lindbergh mania trend of the 1920s and 30s. And then we also have a collection of space memorabilia from a later period, so the 60s and beyond. And this contains, again, popular culture items, mass-marketed items. So I think there are, here at Udvar-Hazy, we have really kind of three distinct moments in aerospace history where we can see how the phenomenon of flight really kind of resonated with the popular imagination.
Do you think that this sort of consumer mania would happen today in the form of objects?
Well, I certainly think that there are current trends that continue this tradition. Absolutely, think about for example, the booming market for toys that are related to popular movies. For example, there are science fiction is another genre that has inspired an entire kind of cottage industry of products that people collect and trade and talk about at at conventions. So I certainly think that there are many, many parallels, not only kind of generally, but in aerospace specifically.
Any questions from our on-site audience?
Does the King collection only include American artifacts?
So the question is, does the King collection only include American artifacts? That's a great question. It does not, actually. There are some artifacts from other countries. One of the items that is not on display is a button. It's fascinating because the design is identical to a Lucky Lindy button that was manufactured here in the United States, but this is a button that was manufactured, or at least it was sold in Cuba. And so after Lindbergh, after his transatlantic flight, he conducted a goodwill flight through Latin America, and the same phenomenon was happening there, that people completely adored him, and there were all kinds of objects that were sold to commemorate when he visited different places. So we do have some examples of items from other countries in the collection, even though it is mostly American.
Can you show us a little bit more about the tools?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so these are tools that Lindbergh brought with him on the Spirit of St. Louis. And one of the amazing things about that flight was that if you just think about the technical circumstances of accomplishing this, he was by himself. It was 33 and a half hours over open water. The plane had a single engine, and he prepared extensively. And that was really the key to his success. He had the plane modified, or he was involved in the design of the plane so that the engine could hold more fuel. And he was just absolutely meticulous about thinking through every kind of exigency. He was an incredibly skilled navigator, and so all of these things were, I think, are a testimony to his incredibly careful planning, which resulted in the success of that flight.
Any other on-site questions?
Are the items in the case rotated?
Are the items in the case rotated? That's a really good question. They have not been rotated since the case was installed, but there is a possibility that in the future we may change some of the things that are on display, since the collection is so rich, and we have items in storage as well.
What would you like to put in?
What would I like? Well, certainly I think the underwear is a really interesting example of Lindbergh's enduring cultural appeal. I would like to put in, I think, some of the objects that are not of U.S. origin. All right. Thank you very much.